So hello, everyone. I'm Audrey Asson. I'm the EU coordinator for GeoBlue Planet initiative hosted by Mercator Ocean International in Toulouse, France. Thank you for joining this event to the All Atlantic 2021 conference on the challenges and opportunity in tackling marine litter across the tropical Atlantic Ocean. This event is hosted by Mercator Ocean International, and it is co-organized by GeoBlue Planet, the Oceanographic Engineer Society of IEEE, the European Commission EU for Ocean Ops FPI, the Atlantic International Research Air Center, the French Ifremer Institute, and Ocean Predict. Marine litter is a multidimensional challenge with economic, environmental, cultural, and human health costs. From fishing gear to cosmetic microbeads, various forms and sizes of plastic litter are found from pole to pole near the coastal shores to the depth of the ocean. It is known now that beyond degrading the aesthetics of our coastal zones, marine litter is harmful to life and can be a vector for pollutants and pathogens. To address this issue, the United Nations created the Sdg Target 14.1, stating by 2025, we ought to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds from land-based activities, including marine debris. To achieve this goal, there is a need to identify marine litter and assess marine litter observation and detection methods to inform policy. This side event engages Atlantic key partners with a dialogue to identify needs, issues, and opportunities around the marine litter monitoring and mitigation, but also works to establish essential collaborations between nations, international and regional initiatives, and scientists to jointly address this unprecedented challenge. Today, we have no less than 12 amazing participants from all around the Atlantic Ocean. This side event will be articulated around the challenges and opportunities in tackling marine litter. The first session will provide the state-of-the-art overview of the current knowledge we have on marine debris, its impact on marine life and economy, as well as unprecedented monitoring capabilities that we now have. In the second session, actors of solutions to marine debris will present how knowledge provided by scientists benefits education, but also decision-making. And lastly, the third session will be interactive, bringing around the table stakeholders and the scientific community to engage in collaboration and the design of services for targeted users. The discussion will be led by François Galgani from the French Ifremer Institute in Corsica. These events will last for 2 hours, but timing is short, but we will have short breaks in between sessions. We will not have time to take any questions from the audience, but you can ask your question in the Q&A Zoom box. If the question is aimed at a specific speaker during his talk or after his talk, please specify the name of the speaker so we will be able to reply to you. But without further ado, we will start the first session. We will have today our first session, 3 speakers. We're going to have Dr. Lauren Bierman from the Plymouth Marine Lab in the UK. She will present our monitoring and forecasting capabilities. She will be followed by Dr. Hans-Peter Plagg from the Oceanographic Engineer Society of IEEE, who will present future challenges associated with coast urbanization growth. But first of all, Dr. José Ferreira from Nova University in Portugal will present tremendous impact of marine litter on society, and especially in the Azores. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I'll keep it to time and hopefully he can speak straight after me. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of different remote sensing data sets and techniques for monitoring of marine plastic litter, and also talk a little bit about how we're not just progressing the method forward, but in order to get to a stage where we're able to forecast where things go, we're creating villages of experts and people, but I'll talk more about that as we go. Can you move to the next slide, please? So only recently it was demonstrated for the first time that satellites are a viable technique or method for the detection of marine macroplastics in coastal waters. So this was through the use of high-resolution satellite data from the European Space Agency operated satellite Sentinel-2, with the potential for application to drones and other high-resolution optical sensors already in low Earth orbit. And that was the paper, and as you can see, it was only published last year. Okay, next slide is fine. Now, you might be thinking, well, if Sentinel-2A and B have been flying since 2015 and 2017, why has it taken us so long to get to a stage where we can detect it? Well, you may have guessed this, it's really tricky. First of all, we do get data coverage every 2 to 5 days at 10-meter spatial resolution, but the sensors that we're using are optical. So we're limited by all of the normal things like cloud and wave caps, contributions from the atmosphere and glint, but furthermore, we're also reliant on some mesoscale features. And the reason for that is even at 10-meter or 1-meter resolution, you're never really going to be able to spot something as small as a single piece of plastic. You need aggregating factors. So if you go to the next slide, hopefully this video plays. And what you can see is this is a sort of typical coastal environment. You've got a swimmer who's raising awareness here. But what has happened is a front has gathered all of that material into a patch. And if that is about the size of a Sentinel-2 pixel, that's 10 by 10 meters, what you have there is you have a mix of natural materials, floating plastics, and the underlying water type. And you can only tell those apart thanks to the 12 bands, so the spectral range on Sentinel-2. Each satellite has slightly different eyes. They can see into the near-infrared or the shortwave infrared. Sometimes there's 4 bands, sometimes there's 21. But for Sentinel-2, there are 12, and we use information in about 4 of them very heavily. And we do that to create different indices. We use one that's conventionally used across the terrestrial environment and normalized difference vegetation index, as well as a floating debris index that we developed at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that this has just recently been accepted for publication, so this will hopefully come out soon. But one of my students has just shown using hyperspectral data in a lab setting how these 2 indices do very different jobs. So the NDVI is picking up the vegetation, it's a vegetation index, and that floating debris index is very democratic. It's picking up everything floating on the very surface of the water with very little penetration into even a top millimeter of water. If you go to the next slide, when you use data, and the floating debris index is not the index, it's an index, it's an option. But the trick is to be able to tell plastic apart from everything else that floats in the marine environment. So seaweed, driftwood, even the sea foam on the surface of the water has got a spectral signature. And when you look at all of these materials together, that's when you can start to see that plastic has a relatively unique cluster. And if you go to the next slide, this is very sort of finicky work, but in fact, even spectrally, it looks quite unique. So, driftwood always looks quite identifiable. It's got a very distinct signature. The same is true for seawater itself and seaweed as well, and plastics. Of course, if you press the next button, please. We have a lot of examples of things floating in the marine environment that are natural, and I guess fortunately not very many examples of very clear plastics, but enough certainly to build a robust and reproducible method or technique for detecting plastics. So if you go to the next slide, and the next one and the next one, so if you just press it 3 times, that's fine. My workflow is incredibly manual. And so, it can take up to half a day to process a single scene. And if you just press the button one more time, the machine learning step is very quick. It takes a few seconds to run, but of course it took me months to make the training library. So it is an intensive process, but very robust. But now sort of seeing the steps taken to look at a single image where I'm pretty confident of detecting plastics. If you go to the next slide. These are the only places in the world where I have had very confident and reproducible detections that I've seen more than once. And the reason for that is because it's just me. I'm a single person, and in order to actually tackle this problem, let's be honest, it's going to take a village. So if you go to the next slide, you can see all of the collaborators that I'm so lucky to work with. The one I would like to talk about a little bit more is this IOCCG, the International Ocean Color Coordinating Group Task Force on Marine Litter and Debris. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is how we are going to take what is sort of quite technical methodological work and taking it forward, not just to move the method forward, but also to get to where we can start to talk about forecasting. So there are core topics within this task force. There's technologies, algorithms and applications, data sets and interdisciplinary aspects. I'm looking after interdisciplinary aspects with my fellow coordinators. But it is thanks to us creating the central space, really, where everyone working on plastic detection using different types of remote sensing techniques, collecting in situ data, collecting drone data, data from satellites, data from planes, data from boats. We need to bring this all together into a central space in order to progress this work. So if you go to the next slide, please. One of the examples that I'm using or that I'm working on is to support work ongoing in the Pacific Gyre. We're supporting through a working group called Giant Ocean Voyages Institute, who go out every summer to collect ghost nets and plastic debris. And they're removing hundreds of tons of this stuff, and they're committing to remove over £1 million this summer, and they're well on their way already. And if you go to the next slide, I want to say that as much as I'm excited to support this work in the Pacific, I'm here to talk to people working in the Atlantic, because if you press the next button, please, you'll see that we have a real gap here. And I really want to be able to take all of the things that we get from extended Sentinel-2 data collection. Sentinel-2 doesn't collect data normally over open waters, but we're in conversations with ESA in order to do this, promoting ocean literacy, validating transport models, testing different algorithms, supporting removal operations, and validating different approaches with in situ data collected outside of the coastal zone. And that's my gap, is in the Atlantic. So I'm really grateful to Audrey for inviting me today and for the opportunity to speak with you, because I'm hoping, if you go to the next slide, to very soon add your badge to this page and to the village, so that we can start to also support work ongoing in the Atlantic, and start to not only monitor what's going on, but be able to get be able to grapple that forecasting ability going forward. So thank you very much for your time.
My name is Ricardo Ferreira, professor at the Faculty of Science and Technology at Nova University of Lisbon and researcher at MARE, a Marine and Environmental Science Center. One of the research areas at Nova and MARE is marine litter. Our group developed research from the risk assessment impact of marine litter on human health to impact on ecosystems, to circular economy, and to public policies. Today we are going to talk about the societal impacts of marine litter, namely about the work that we are doing in coastal communities, specifically fishing communities, giving as an example Cabo Verde. So to next slide, please. As you know, marine litter has a huge impact on in our entire planet and our oceans. Next slide, please. Affecting biodiversity, fauna and flora, and the serious impact on the fish stocks. Next slide, please. Another one, please, because polluting coastal areas, beaches, affecting the vessels, putting people and environment at risk. Next slide, please. And marine, next slide, please. Marine litter sources are diverse, but 20% of are originated from marine activities, and 10%, next slide, please, from land activities, and the composition is mostly plastic materials. Please, next slide. We also know that plastic degrades but doesn't disappear. For example, on our apparently clean beaches, it is common to find microplastics. Next slide, please. And the problem it's the microplastics. And next slide, sorry, next slide. And the problem is so serious that all over the world, scientific evidence appears that we already breathe and eat and drink micro and nanoplastics. Next slide, please. The impact on society are enormous, but the most vulnerable coastal communities, the most affected by marine litter, by this serious problem. And the question is, are the coastal communities aware of origins of the problem? Are the coastal communities aware that they are also one of the actors that actively contribute to the problem, and also part of the solution? Next slide, please. One of the research areas that we have been developed in MARE consists of the empowerment, the capacity building, and the awareness of the coastal communities, namely fishing communities, both in Portugal and also in Cabo Verde, in order to contribute to for the resolution of the problems, and contribute also to design more efficient and more adapted public policies, more adapted to the reality of each community. From the transatlantic perspective, today we would like to show you the work that we have developed with the community of Porto Mosquito and also Porto Gouveia, two small fishing communities on Santiago Island. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Economically, these communities depend on the fishing activities, and as we know nowadays, all fishing materials is made by plastic, as you can see in these photographs of Porto Mosquito. Next slide, please. And the next one, the fishing nets. Next one, please. In the coastal areas and in the beaches of Cabo Verde, in all of Atlantic, of course, it's very common to see the marine litter scattered broken by the sea, with all the impacts that we already talked about. Next slide. And also this is an impressive image from one of the islands of Cabo Verde. Next slide, please. And also come from land, as this is in this photograph. As I said, next slide, please. These communities depend economically on the sale of the fish in the markets. Next slide, please. As you can see in these photographs, if they sell directly. Next slide. Or in the markets. And another one slide, please. As we can see, and another one, please. Sorry. As I said, the solution to many of these problems related to marine litter involves working directly with the communities. Next slide, please. We have followed an approach, methodology of active community involvement, and in the case of the Cabo Verde, we choose a non-formal and active participatory methodology, brainstorming and active listening workshops, capacity building and training workshops. The group involved, it's very young. Next slide, please. Mostly women and very active, interested, very sympathetic, very creative. Also, it's a pleasure working with this community. Next slide, please. We can see some images of Porto Mosquito workshops like this one. Next slide. Construction, the co-construction of the ideas, the solutions. Next slide. Some images from the workshops of Porto Gouveia, like this one. Next slide. And some images also training local school teachers and students. Most are fishermen, children. They are our true ambassadors. It's next slide, please. So and finally, we would like to share some results of these works with the community, namely the participants' perception regarding the causes, solutions, pathways of the marine litter, considered the causes like we saw in the slide. Consider waste management, community identified the lack of a proper waste management as one of the biggest problems in the island. Considering the origin, people were fast to refer that is not allowed to throw litter of the ocean, of course. So the main part of a litter comes from land, and considering the literacy and environmental processes, the population admitted that there was not enough information regarding this topic, which explains the lack of awareness about marine litter. Next one, please. Related to the waste of find that we found in these communities, 90% are plastic. In those communities, the population could easily identify the plastic as the main component of the marine debris. Next one. And also related to the impacts, some fishermen state that sometimes the fish nets they are abandoned in the sea can wrap around the boat properly. It can damage its results. Some participants claim to have seen some marine species stuck in trash in the ocean, and even claim to have found pieces and pieces of plastic inside their stomachs. Also, some species they are fishing. Next one. About the solutions, the community is aware of the problems regarding waste management and state that more trash bins in the streets and more efficient trash collection in Highland could help prevent the amount of litter that end up in the ocean. And finally, about the literacy processes and the population also state that some campaigns about this topic should be done with the involvement of the community. That's the work that we are doing in Cabo Verde and also in Portugal, but also in Cabo Verde. Next one. Please. At the end, we made a simple diagram to understand how ocean literacy and environmental education can help find solutions to some of the problems that affect the community that we are working with. And the causal diagram helps to realize that it's a complex problem with many dimensions, but ocean literacy can effectively help in reduce waste production, in reduce the marine environmental impacts, and reduce also the marine litter, and increase the efficiency of the waste management. Next slide, please. Without ocean literacy and environmental education of these communities, without awareness, without the active community involvement, with the co-construction of the solutions, without the social empowerment, without the increasing the quality of life and the decent work and fighting the poverty, without all of that, we can have the best laws, we can have the best research studies, we can have also the fantastic and technological solution, but the results will not be satisfactory. Sorry, the next one, please. I hope that the participants have access to the PowerPoint, the presentations. In this sense, at the end, we have a selection of the research projects that are in progress in our research center. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm so sorry about the technical problems in the beginning. Thank you very much.
I would like to talk about coastal urbanization, in particular the growth in coastal urbanization and the risk that future marine debris may result from the urban coasts. I will focus on the ethical challenges that we are facing in living in the coastal zone, particularly in the post-Holocene, which might turn out a time of very rapid changes. I will start by pointing out that humanity has been very lucky because the Holocene was extremely stable. And in the Holocene, we had an extremely stable climate. And about 7,000 years ago, sea level became stable as well. So the Holocene provided a safe operating space for humanity to develop civilization. And when sea level became stable, we were able to have large settlements, permanent settlements in river deltas, and have the benefits of being in these ecologically very valuable areas. But this comes with a normalcy bias, and the normalcy bias tells us that climate variations are small and sea level is stable. This has led to a design for the coastal development that's based on paradigms. Sea level is very stable, coastlines don't move horizontally. So the question is, if this changes, if we have a very large sea level rise, could that potentially create a global catastrophic risks? And in my opinion, I have to say, no, it's a simple problem of geometry. Every animal knows if my habitat gets inundated, I have to move. But humans are different from many other animals. We put a very high priority on the current benefits of today and not so much on the risk in the future. We lack foresight in a certain extent. A precaution is not built into us to a very deep level, and we lack imagination of what might happen in the future. We suffer from a probability neglect. And so we populate the coastal zone and design the built environment as if sea level would never rise. And this creates a global catastrophic risk for future generations, not for us, with the potential for massive harm and widespread injustice. When we look at how the coastal urban coast has developed, we can see that in 1800 there was very little population in the coastal zone. That changed particularly in the last 100 years, and today very many large cities are in the coastal zone. Tokyo, for example, in 2005, 34 million people. And when we look into the future, by 2100, we expect that the 10 largest cities have a more than triple population than today, from 200 million to 637 million. And most of those cities are either in the coastal zone or in flood zones of major rivers. So marine debris, which is a growing problem today for the marine biosphere and humanity, is something that may actually increase a lot in the future because of what we are building in the coastal zone. A major fraction of the marine debris is plastic. And when we look at plastic and how much has been produced, we see that a very large amount of plastic has been produced. When around in 2015, for example, almost 450 million tons were produced. The average use time is very short. In some cases, for a very large fraction, it's only less than 6 months. But we also have to see that a very large amount of this goes into construction. If we assume a 2% annual increase, as we had in the past in production, then by 2045, 870 million tons of plastic will be produced. In total, by 2045, 26 billion tons of plastic will have been produced. And if we assume that only 1% of that goes into the ocean, we will have 260 million tons of plastic in the ocean. And in the coastal built environment prone to disasters, we estimate that there will be 1.7 billion tons of plastic in the built environment. So plastic in the planetary physiology will impact many people in the future. If we assume that it will be impacting people for the next 5,000 years, we can assume that it may be 500 billion people to be born over the next 5,000 years that are impacted by what we are doing today with plastic. And we can ask whether this plastic crisis is violating the rights of those yet not born. When we think about that, the climate system has a very high inertia, and that the ocean needs to be heated up with a large amount of energy to get an equilibrium temperature with the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we can see today already signs that we are heading for a system with significantly less land-based ice and with significantly changed dynamics. So in principle, we know the future. The only thing what we don't know is when this future is going to arrive. So the future of 30, 40 meters of sea level rise is something that most likely will happen, but we don't know whether the time scale I'm showing right here is the right one, or whether this may be much faster, or even in worst case, extremely fast because of the extremely fast changes in climate. And that puts the urban coast into a system between the terrestrial hinterland and the ocean and marine biosphere. And traditionally, the urban coast is exposed to hazards originating in the ocean atmosphere system, hurricanes, tsunamis, and many other inundation, coastal flooding, and hazards originating from the solid earth and the terrestrial hydrosphere. And we are focusing on those and think about how we can make the urban coast more resilient to those hazards. What we are not focusing on are the hazards that may originate from the urban coast in the future. And it's these hazards that I am worried about and that I want to point out as a potential risk for future generations. It may be not New York that is going to look like this in this century, but Jakarta may look like that before the end of the century. That means much of what is built in Jakarta may be inundated, may be under sea surface, and may contribute to marine debris in the ocean. So the ethical challenge that I am addressing here is how to live in the coastal zone while reducing the risk of marine debris for future generations. The two ethical principles that we have in our normative ethics are a duty not to participate in creating massive harm, and that includes future generations, and a duty to justice, and that includes intergenerational justice. So we show that we take this very seriously. For example, when we talk about nuclear waste, and this is an example where we are thinking about what we can do to have a warning on our nuclear waste that isn't understandable in 10,000 years from now for people who might get into contact with our nuclear waste. But we are not doing the same for the risk of marine debris, which may be much larger than the nuclear waste that we leave behind for future generations. So what I'm saying is we need a new paradigm for coastal development that's based on foresight. And the foresight tells us sea level may change a lot in the future. Coastlines can start to move horizontally a lot, particularly in the river deltas that are very flat in areas where we like to build very large cities. So what we need to do is we need to look at the fundamental consequences of this new paradigm. We need to think about how we can redefine and manage real estate property in the coastal zone. We need to think about a design of the urban coast that includes future inundation as a design principle. We need to anticipate new extreme events that may happen because of more frequent and more stronger hurricanes and cyclones. We need to think about, can we invent infrastructure that would be able to move with the coastal zone or be moved with the coastal zone. We might even have to separate where we live and where we work. We work where it is needed, for example, in a harbor, but we live where it's safe, further away, and make sure that people can get from where they live to where they work. We also need to redistribute the risk between individuals, communities, states, country, and maybe even the international community. And we need to think about how we can distribute the risk between the generations. If we take responsibility for future generations, one way of doing this would be to come up with a convention on marine debris originating from the urban coast, which then would give guidelines to how we need to develop the urban coast to reduce the risk for future generations. Thank you very much.
This session will focus on using scientific knowledge for communication and policymaking. Just as for the first session, almost, we will have three presentations. Dr. Denise Mitrano from ETH in Zurich, Switzerland, will present how scientific knowledge can push the design of plastic and its regulation to protect the environment upstream. Followed by Dr. Alex Tura, joining us from Brazil, and it's UNESCO Chair on Ocean Sustainability. He will tell us about how observation can drive policymaking from high to local levels. But before that, our first speaker of the session is Enga Mbayaya from the Africa Youth Waste Network in South Africa. She will introduce her to the great network her team has been doing with local communities and, of course, children. Enga, please, if you can turn on your camera and your mic, the floor is yours.
Molweni and greetings from Gqeberha, South Africa. I am Enga Mbayaya and I'm the African Youth Waste Network Coordinator for Sustainable Seas Trust. And I'm so excited to be speaking here today. Next slide, please. Millions of people in Africa do not understand that marine litter is a dimensional problem with economic, environmental, and cultural and human health costs. The nature of the challenges that we face today collectively as a society are in dire need of scientific report. Many countries in Africa lack basic waste management skills and services and turn to dumping and illegal burning of waste, and this can harm the environment. There is a lack of education and educational resources that affect marine litter. The teachers have limited capacity and there's poor teaching infrastructure. Next slide, please. Our work at Sustainable Seas Trust is important because Africa has some of the most exquisite marine coastlines and it needs to be protected. Our work at Sustainable Seas Trust touch on 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are circled in red. Next slide, please. Our mission is to generate knowledge through research and education that inspires actions and lead to clean, healthy, sustainable seas and flourishing communities living alongside them. We do this by focusing on our 4 operational pillars, which are education, research, enterprise and development, communications, and networking. Our research department tells us what is happening and what we should do and provides the base for decision-making. We are trying to establish the amount of litter that we have and the types of litter that we have and where we should focus our efforts. Our enterprise development department addresses the unemployment and the poor living conditions, while our communications and networking department works as an active platform for collaborations, networking, and resource sharing. Slide 5, please. In order to counter the deficit in the waste marine education that our youth faces, the African Youth Waste Network plugs into the education department, which is directly benefited with the trials and methods which are tested by our department. The networks that are circled in red act as a tool to bridge the gap between research and policy, to improve the flow of information and also make it accessible and understandable to all members of society. One of our main problems is that we can't communicate. Our scientists are not able to speak to the public, and our educators do not pass on the information to the public as well as our economic sector that doesn't share the potential and the smart opportunities that make plastic so economically viable. What we do at SST is bring it all together to strengthen the process that will create further commitment to capacity building in our national systems. Next slide, please. Sustainable Seas Trust has recognized that there's a need to educate the African youth. 60% of the African youth is under the age of 25, and it is the youngest and the second most polluted continent. This then poses the question, is the African youth ready to meet the current and future social, economic, and educational challenges that will arise with plastic pollution? With our 4 pillars at SST, it works as an organization infrastructure that allows us to contribute to a knowledge-based economy, which sees the African youth as a demographic dividend to empower Africa. So how do we do this? How do we empower Africa? Next slide, please. Our education department focuses on 3 main areas, which is knowledge transfer, capacity building, and skills transfer. Next slide, please. In meeting the education challenges, we have acknowledged that there is no existing curriculum on plastics in Africa, and there's no definite African guide to plastics. So SST is developing a curriculum from grade Rs to grade 10s, which will include multiple fonts to cater to dyslexic and to private and public school students. It will also be translated to our partnering countries, and the teachers will have online access to the content before accessing all the materials. Next slide, please. And in these images, you see some of our educators and our youth in action. And if you look at the third image, on top, you see munch. Munch is a large wired coelacanth fish, and it's a recycling deposit. Munch was developed by two children in that picture, aged 11 and 8, and SST took their idea and developed it into a recycling program for schools, which has the capacity to generate 12,000 Rand, which is approximately $1,000 as a quarterly income for the schools. And this is all by transferring recycling materials into Munch. So Munch is able to be an interactive tool that teaches people how to sort out waste from a very young age. Next slide, please. My mom is still not clear what I do for a living. She honestly thinks I just pick up plastic and sort it. But it's so much more than that. I see this network as a way to incorporate my love for developing the youth with a passion for the ocean. I get the opportunity of working with diverse backgrounds, and I change the narrative for the environments that I live in. Next slide, please. My daily job entails providing soft skills for capacity building through educational materials and working on online platforms contributing to plastic pollution education. Next slide, please. We use the African Waste Academy to increase access to education, and we have established an online education platform which is fully mobile compatible. The AWA provides an exciting interaction between Africa and other countries through knowledge and skills exchange. There's a meaningful real-time interactions which is aimed at the public sector. We host these webinars with a range of international presenters, and this year we've had attendees join us live from 47 different countries. Next slide, please. Our reach thus far, we have mapped out 3,003 organizations in over 40 African countries, which are all waste focused. And this is to create a network and to share knowledge and resources. Next slide, please. Our challenges thus far, though, is that there is a lack of structure, resources, and systems. And in Africa, there are very different social economic dynamics that we need to consider. Research also competes with political interests, opinions, and values, and research can sometimes be the least most important factor to influence policymaking. And I believe that all the issues that we face today can be informed by research, as long as it has a sustainable development focus and looks at improving the lives of others. Next slide, please. And on that note, I want to leave you with a quote from Utatu Nelson Mandela. And he says, everyone can rise up their circumstances and achieve success if they are dedicated and passionate about what they do. And we think research and education can bring passionate youth to act and care for the environment. Next slide, please. A big thank you to the organizers and everyone listening. Please do scan our QR code, which is there on the poster, and you can get the latest information about Sustainable Seas Trust. And you can also contact me for more information. And Enkosi, all the way from Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga, for a very interesting talk. And I really enjoyed that QR code, a very innovative way of getting information. We will have all the information you guys watching might need on the website, but I will, on the event website, but I will talk about this at the end. It's Denise's turn to speak, I believe. If you can turn on your camera and we'll be starting. Here you go.
Great, thank you so much, Audrey, and to all the organizers today to give me the opportunity to speak. My name is Denise Matrano. I'm professor of environmental chemistry of anthropogenic materials at ETH Zurich. And today I'd like to discuss with you a bit about microplastic regulations and specifically why they need to be more precise to both incentivize innovation and environmental safety. Next slide, please. As we can all appreciate, going from microplastic research to regulation and material design is a long task that we can all work together. The first step is to be able to assess microplastic inputs and implications in the environment. And this is what many of us in the field are doing today to better understand what these negative impacts of plastic in the environment are. Next. Once we better understand these different impacts, we can make scientifically informed decisions about how to develop good regulation to curtail unnecessary and negative impacts of plastic in the environment. Next. With this, we will further be able to design more sustainable and environmentally conscious materials in the future so that they will be less harmful to the environment. Next. There are many different types of plastic and plastic pollution which may make its way into the environment. And generally, we can understand that these are made of a diverse group of polymers and different types of materials, but they're often considered under this one large umbrella term, plastics. But from a material science point of view, this may be a little bit simplistic. Also, when we're looking at the reasons why different plastics are made, some of them actually have good beneficial reasons to be produced and used, even in the form of microplastic. So most microplastic, small polymer particles that are less than 5 millimeters in size, are made by degraded waste, but some of them are actually used for intended purposes. Next slide. But what do we really know and what is really unknown about microplastics in the environment? Next. As scientists, we're still studying the eco and human toxicological effects of microplastics, even though this has received a lot of attention in recent years. There's little still concrete information on the sources and distribution of microplastic, and the transport processes about how plastic gets around the globe are still being well defined, as was highlighted well in the first talk from today. And this way, both exposure and hazard inform the risk assessment, and these are both still subject to really large uncertainties. However, what we can all agree on as scientists is that plastic, and subsequently microplastic, is a really persistent material which is widely dispersed in many ecosystems with many unknown ecological consequences. So we need to really think carefully about in which context we use plastic and how to better mitigate plastic into the environment when it's not absolutely necessary to use it for different purposes. Next slide, please. When we look at the sources of solid microplastics, as I mentioned, most of these sources are from the slow degradation of mismanaged plastic waste into the environment, or from using consumer items that slowly break down over time. This can include plastic bottles or bags, using of textiles or tires, or degradation of plastic films when we look at agriculture. However, there are other types of microplastic particles which may enter the environment on purpose. Next slide. These include primary microplastics, which are used in cosmetics or actually used as agrocapsules when we put herbicides and pesticides onto fields. Some of these aspects might be easy to replace, such as in the case of cosmetics, but others serve a very good and targeted purpose to be able to actually reduce other negative impacts on the environment, such as the widespreading of pesticides. And so this is where careful regulation can really come into play about the materials that we would like to use. Next slide, please. So the diversity of polymers and their applications really complicates policy development in general. So REACH registration, which is specifically valid in Europe, usually considers singular compounds, but microplastics are considered collectively, even though it's a really heterogeneous group of materials. Next. Overarching chemical bans may be appropriate when there's clear and overwhelming evidence that a targeted substance might cause harm. So for example, if we look at bisphenol A or DDT, it was easy to be able to take these certain chemicals and materials out of production because there was one targeted substance. But microplastics and plastics are a very large group of materials. Next. In this way, can all microplastics be regulated in the same way given this diversity, or can they really be regulated at all, since most microplastics are actually just coming from the degradation of mismanaged macroplastic waste? Next slide, please. So here I'd like to give a small recipe for microplastic regulation so that we would be able to better to be able to develop policies which can target these unnecessary uses of plastic. Next. The first is that precise definitions are needed. So this is helpful because we can specify the desirable aspects of microplastics that we still may want to use, and also be able to have a common language for understanding between scientists, regulators, and the public about what this term microplastic actually means. Next. The next ingredient is the capability to measure microplastics with our current analytical capabilities. Right now, this is really difficult, but we need to really harmonize these different capabilities so that we can actually be able to measure well across the board and be able to feasibly monitor plastics when they are in our water sources or in our food sources. And the next recipe is the linking microplastics with specific hazards. Right now, we have a precautionary principle, which is to ban all microplastics, but it would actually be better to target actual impacts when we know which specific polymers or additives are actually causing the harm of microplastics. And the final ingredient would be, next, please. The final ingredient would be having an enforceable and consistent regulation. This is really twofold for this reason. The first is that it can provide clarity for the industry and so that they can target specific compounds which may be more sustainable. And the second is protection for consumers. So when something's labeled microplastic free, they really know that it is true and really microplastic free. Next. So let's look at a snapshot of the current microplastic regulations. If you can see on the next slide, we can look through some of these different pieces of the recipe. The first is this precise definition, which is needed. Next. In the EU, the REACH principle has a principle of no data, no market to ensure the safe use of chemicals. And this is already in place for a lot of polymers and plastics today. And this goes in a tiered structure on how plastics are regulated. So in the first level that we can see next, would be the regulation of the polymer itself. Now, polymers are often exempted from regulation because they have a low solubility and a low bioavailability. However, there are sector-specific regulations which apply, such as food contact materials or baby toy items. The next level of registration would be the regulation of the additive. So in the EU, under REACH, if over 1 ton of manufactured additive is produced, then this is subject to regulation. And a similar aspect is taking place in the US under TSCA. But a new tier of this regulation, next, is for the regulation of primary solid microplastics. So here, various regulations and reportings are in place regionally or globally, but I will look for the purpose of this talk, mostly in the EU market, which is what we had focused on in our recent study. So they have a really complex definition of microplastic by ECHA. And so this is really all encompassing to have very small particles to very large particles of any type of polymer which is being used. And it is difficult for industries to be able to make anything out of plastic. And so they must opt for plastic-free alternatives. If we can go to the next, this makes it very difficult for companies to abide by, and it's also difficult to analytically measure these regulations. It's very challenging, and currently our analytical capabilities are not able to measure if something is a microplastic as defined by ECHA. And in this way, if it's not measurable, it's not enforceable. Next. So we would also like to be able to bridge the assessment of microplastics with other particles and chemicals, so, because there's already a lot of testing in place to see if there's a safe use of other types of chemicals besides plastics. Next. So here we would like to really link microplastics with specific hazards. Next. So the concept of hazard testing is really challenged when we think about microplastics because there are a few standardized tests, for example, from the OECD or ISO test methods, where for materials that have low solubility or have large particle sizes, such as with microplastic. Next. And most importantly, the toxicity data, as we've seen so far, doesn't yet define which properties are specific to microplastic causing harm. Is it the microplastic size, the shape, the chemical compositions, or the additives? In this way, it makes it really difficult for companies to avoid those types of properties which may be the most harmful. Next. And lastly, we should have enforceable and consistent regulations. Next. This is quite important because currently we have a very vague concept of corporate sustainability. And this allows companies to be able to say something is more environmentally friendly without that not necessarily being the case. So without policy restricting certain materials, technologies, or additives and setting long-term sustainability goals, industry is much more likely to favor short-term wins with superficial changes. So this gives the rise of possibilities of companies making false claims. And in this way, consumers won't be protected because they won't really understand if something is microplastic free or not. Next. So when we look at the relative impacts of using plastic compared to other materials, which we may be able to substitute for microplastic, what are some of the things that we have to consider when we're using primary microplastic in a product? The first thing is that we need to consider what are the environmental health impacts caused by microplastic use, and can we link specific plastic aspects with hazard? The next aspect is what alternatives currently exist or can be brought to market in the near term, which provides similar functionality. A good example of this was with cosmetics products, where we could easily substitute and cheaply substitute microbeads that were used as scrubbers for other more sustainable and environmentally friendly alternatives. But that's not the case with all different types of microplastic usage. The next thing that we have to consider is what is the cost of replacement materials and to whom? Is it us as consumers who are bearing this cost, or will the industry actually pay for these better innovations? And lastly, we need to see if we can have new substitutions which can be developed, which actually outperform microplastics with fewer adverse outcomes. And of course, this would be the ideal goal in the future. Next. So when we look at the future outlook for microplastic regulation and design, there's two different stages. The first is looking at the regulation itself, and the next is looking at the material design. So for regulations, we need to make sure that they're measurable and enforceable. And for this, we really need a precise definition, as well as something that is actually analytically possible to be able to measure with current technologies. The current regulations leave little room for the development for our industry, except for plastic-free alternatives. While this might sound good at the face of it, sometimes plastic is actually a more sustainable solution than other avenues. And more precise and directed regulations would allow industry to test or screen for these most hazardous properties if they must use microplastic. And in that case, if they were to find a hazardous property, they could opt for alternatives. Next. But it can't be microplastic regulation alone which solves the environmental plastic crisis, as we already saw also from some of the other talks today about waste management and understanding the role of plastic in the environment. From a material science point of view, we would hopefully be able to develop sustainable materials and have targeted microplastic use when it makes environmental sense. We have to keep in mind that a lot of the research has gone into the current commodity polymers and plastics which we use today. And so their physical and chemical properties, as well as their cost, are really optimized from the viewpoint of the manufacturer. However, when we continue to have additional research funds and development to be able to make new materials, these alternative materials will likely catch up in terms of both price and performance in the future. Next. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I'd be happy to have more of your questions in the chat or be able to discuss more with you in the breakout session after.
Thank you, Denise, for an always very interesting talk. We will now move on to Alex Tura from joining us from Brazil. So if you can turn on mic and camera, that would be perfect.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you. No worries.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the possibility to talk about this issue, which is observation-driven policy making. So I will bring some examples, some global examples and a local example here in Brazil. So to begin, next slide, please. Thank you. So we are talking about a complex issue, as we saw in the previous presentations. We have different sources from the sea, from the land, and even from these locations. They are complex and different sources. Next one. We have different sinks, and there is a flux between the different sinks. We are talking about the sea surface, the sea bottom, the biota, the coastline, and within these compartments, we have subcompartments that make the identification of sinks and the movement of particles between these compartments very difficult to understand. Next. So when we go to the beach and see all these types of litter, we identify that we have different pathways which will demand different policies, especially when we try to understand the motivations for these policies. So it's important to understand that there should be a very clear and objective relationship from the understanding of types of litter, pathways, to the policies a given place intends to put in place. Next. And that's the point. Sorry for the mistake here in the slide. That's why the example report published in 2019 was done to harmonize ways to do a monitoring and assessment of plastic litter in the ocean, understanding the importance of having very objective and robust information so that we can use this to take decisions. And this report gave and is furnishing an important guidance so that member states, nations, and states and municipalities to implement monitoring schemes. Next one. One of the main aspects or most important aspects of this report is to identify policy concerns. So this picture, this figure is inside the report, and it brings to us why should we measure things in the ocean, measure plastics, measure marine litter in the ocean. And if we don't have these questions in mind, the information we get may be useless or meaningless because it's not connected to a desire, a wish, a vision of future in terms of the policies and the consequences of the policies. So we are talking about hotspots, so where the litter is concentrating. We are talking about trends in space and time. We are talking about identifying sources based on the information driven or derived from what we can see in the items, and which kind of impacts and how, especially how our measures are being effective or not. Next one. So the example report presented the different types of information we can get from monitoring, considering compartments, subcompartments, the size of plastics, linked to the policy concerns. We are talking about tourism, food safety, human health and injuries, navigational hazards, fisheries, and aquaculture, animal welfare, and biodiversity. So these are some of the policy concerns we may have related to the issue of marine litter. Next one. And based on that, we applied this concept in São Paulo State in a partnership with the São Paulo State government here in Brazil and the Embassy of Norway to try to understand how to put it in practice, considering a local reality. Next one. We focused on 3 types of indicators, of sources of information to support decision-making. So we considered generation indicators, exposure indicators, and effect indicators. Next one. This is an example of the indicators we are proposing. Some in the left-hand side, we have indicators of generation, some of them related to the way the cities and municipalities are structured, the conditions they have to manage litter, for example. And in the right-hand side, we have exposure indicators strongly linked with the GESEM proposal. Next one. And then in the end of the last year, São Paulo State created this São Paulo State Solid Waste Plan, where it has now 5 targets related to marine litter based on the information we get from these different types of indicator. And now São Paulo State has a state policy to face marine litter, and will put in place in the next years. Next one. So the idea is to create ecosystems of innovation, not only talking about technology, but also considering governance and institutional arrangements that are extremely important to generate the data and share the data forever, so that we can have this information being tracked to support the elaboration of policies, but also to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy in a way to link science and decision-making at the local level too. Next one. This is completely linked, strongly linked to the strategies of GPML that are exemplified here. So we are trying to link science and policy to foster national and subnational plans, to reinforce the need and the importance of guidelines, standards, and harmonization of data gathering. Of course, this will demand sustainable and innovative financing, and this should be available to all. Next one. And considering the prime meeting of the Ministerial Conference on Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution conducted last week, we may consider that there are some important gaps. One is coordination of actions. Another one is institutional and legal arrangements at the national and subnational levels, capacity building, and data governance from the production to sharing. So this could be a synthesis of the discussions of the last week. Next one. Having that, we will be able to upscale the information from the local level to the global level in a way to build additional information to feed into the SDG 14. Next one. And this brings us to the idea of the importance of fostering national and subnational initiatives to internalize the needs of using proper information to take decisions that are sustained over time. That's my final message. Thank you very much.
All right, I will welcome back everyone to the side event, to the All Atlantic 2021 Conference on Challenges and Opportunities in Tackling Marine Litter Across the Atlantic Ocean. This is session number 3. We'll be having a panel discussion to foster connection, action, and cooperation between scientists and stakeholders. To lead this discussion today, we have Dr. François Galgani from Ifremer, France. I will leave him the task to introduce the discussion, as well as introducing our panelists present today. François, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Thanks to the panelists and for sure to the participants to be here today. The idea behind the session today is to have a discussion about monitoring, how it's necessary it is to have it global, and to discuss about its governance and its future, especially from the science and technology point of view, to see whether, updating the approaches and method could help to monitor. So there will be a good opportunity to advance in that direction. And it's important to know that there will be a ministerial session later this afternoon, named Rethinking Our Stewardship of Ocean and Water as well. Contribution from citizen scientists could help in the global monitoring. And I think I may also promote a conclusion from the workshop today to that session. And we may have some support then coming from all Atlantic meeting and ministries. So I think it could be important to have some input, relevant input there. So just an overview about where we are and open the discussion then later. So we have different initiatives related to the governance. We have the G7 that was started in 2015 with its global platform. We have the G20. We have UNEA that is very active, especially discussing actually for a new treaty or governance, any kind of agreements on the marine litter. That will be very important for the future. We have UN-related bodies. IMO for sea-based source of litter, FAO for fishing litter from fishing. Sorry, And then we have some more regional initiatives, such as the one from the European Commission, named Mission Starfish. I will not go in detail on all regional initiatives because there are so many, even being global. But we have also support from scientists. So there are various initiatives also in that. Some are missing, such as the one, that was presented earlier today by Lauren Bierman, the International Ocean Color Coordinating Group, for instance, to the use of satellites for monitoring and so on. And so not only we have initiative, but we have also some other actors. Next slide, please. So first of all, we have this global platform. And I would say that the talk from Alex was a good introduction to the session, the actual session. And the work done by GPML, which is much appreciated. And we have also a scientific platform. IOC is considering to support, the monitoring of some indicators related to marine litter. We have regional platforms, those from regional sea conventions, or MSFD, for instance, of ICIS or PICIS in the North Pacific. We have national platforms. We have scientific institutions that are involved in large-scale monitoring. And we have large NGOs also bringing some expertise in the field of monitoring. We cannot miss the work done by citizen science and all initiative. There was one presentation earlier today by Anga Mevia that was really appreciated and showing, it may help to support the global monitoring. This is probably the field, marine litter, where the most citizens are contributing. And it's really important to consider that as a good support for global monitoring then later. Next slide, please. So we have the Regional Sea Convention. So the work from the GISAMP was presented. It is focusing on the harmonization of different processes. We may have some questions on that later during the panel. Next slide, please. We have the different Regional Sea Convention. And just one example, it's not to consider that we would like to promote any kind of, but a European Commission is very active in the field of marine litter, supporting some directives on it, on plastic, the ban of single-use plastics, for instance, the monitoring through the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and some other plans, such as zero pollution with very constraining targets for the years to come, and the Mission Starfish. I will give just very few details on that. Please, next slide. So the mission is about to be launched and first agreed by the European Commission very soon, and supporting a plan to regenerate all your EU waters, but also some other, like in the Mediterranean, for instance, in North Atlantic. You cannot work alone, and it's just with all parties that you will be able to reach all these focuses. And the idea is to change the way we are, change our economy, I would say. So it's more transitional to new types of economy, decarbonizing and so on, zero pollution, regenerating marine waters and so on. And plastic litter will be highly considered in that plan. It will be launched, at the end of this year and for the next 10 years. And there will be a good support for not only reduction measures and so on, but also for monitoring. Next slide, please. So as it was said by Alex, the strategy is remain complex because we have to choose the compartments to be monitored, either the sea surface, where we can have a global scan using satellites and so on, or the sea floor, where we have most of the litter sinking. And so these are some examples. You can see down right the example of seafloor litter that has been monitored on the basis of regular monitoring, and then we have the database for that. And more interesting is the down left pictures. It's a result from the project Clean Atlantic, and it shows how the litter from Europe are, traveling and going to the western part of the Atlantic. And so it means that monitoring cannot be something else than global, because otherwise we will miss all transboundary boundaries problems and so on. And so it's very, very important to consider this aspect that we cannot solve the problem just by one decision somewhere if it's not coordinated and harmonized. So it's very important to consider the issue as being global. Next slide, please. But it's not only monitoring, it's also science to support that. We have many challenges to face still now. We are looking for the most cost-effective methods. We are looking for automated sensors, the use of satellites. It was well presented by Lauren earlier today. We have new approaches like risk assessment modeling may also help, and it's quite important to consider all these approaches. Then about solutions, I think that there is one that has not been discussed, and now it's about recycling. I think that it's a critical step, and solving the issue of recycling could be, really supporting the reduction of marine litter at sea. Next slide, please. That's it. So maybe Audrey, want to introduce start the panel, or you want me to start immediately on that? Or?
You can go ahead. No worries.
Okay. So welcome to the panelists. We'll have eight top-level specialists in different fields participating. So Dr. Alex Tura from Brazil, AD from UNEP, Nairobi, GPML. We have Dr. Abdoulaye Gagana, which is from UNEP Abidjan Convention. We have also Marek Feeling from the OSPAR Convention. We have Michael Papadionakis from the European Commission. Christopher Corbin from the Cartagena Convention. Denise Mitrano is from ETH Switzerland. And we have also Dr. Lauren Bierman from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, but also International Ocean Color Coordination Group. So the way we may work is, I do have some questions, so I will just ask to some of you to maybe, it's open to all of the panelists, but I will probably direct my question to some of you, and then at the end we have an open discussion and trying to conclude something. My first question, in fact, is about how the future of monitoring is seen, and especially from the science side, and with the advance of new observing technologies, drone, satellites, and so on modeling. And I think that Lauren could respond this question and let us know about, her view. And before I go to the other panelists, Lauren, do you have an idea? Of?
Yes. So I think you've raised some interesting points as well, stuff that I really, really agree with, which is obviously you might expect because of my remote sensing background. I would say, well, remote sensing is the silver bullet, it's the key. And that is absolutely not my perspective at all. And that's also why I think the IOCCG group, that the task force is so important, and why I love the role that I have, which is in multidisciplinary, because it includes things like citizen science. I speak a lot about recycling. I absolutely love what I've seen today about like the different aspects, from microplastics to megaplastics, to the role of citizen scientists, in situ data, remote sensing, sort of almost filling a nice gap, I think, between in situ data, which can be really fine scale, and these huge global circulation models that tell us sort of broadly where things end up. But until now, that remote sensing sort of it fills in that gap. But I think we need to look at this holistically, not just about lots of players, but all of the levels. Yeah. And I think the future of monitoring has to really be comprehensive and take all of the tools at our disposal, because this is such a complicated problem and we need everything that we can use, right?
Yeah, okay. And I heard about a new method to assess microplastics, for instance. It comes from IEA, it's an international agency for nuclear energy, and they propose something what they call new plast or something. Are you aware of this kind of new approach, and if it's interesting, or I don't know about that?
Yeah, so I've been hearing stirrings about it, and there's a group at Plymouth Marine Laboratory who are specifically invested in looking at how microplastics enter the food chain, the radio labeling, the fluorescence detection, and I find all of that. I've always said detecting and removing macroplastics is really hard, but also in comparison to microplastics, really easy. So I get really excited when I see these new techniques around microplastics, because they're such a big challenge, and they're everywhere.
And could we have some proxies? I mean, detecting by satellites large objects and understanding that it may support the modeling of small objects, by the way, or?
Absolutely. So we know microplastics can move very differently, but at the same time, they're governed by fundamental rules as well. So the role of oceanographic features like fronts, sediment in terms of resuspension. So yes, in terms of the proxies, even investigating the role of seaweed and water plants carrying microplastics into the coastal zone Do they hold on to them? Are they a good proxy for microplastics?
Yeah.
Where in the water column do we expect them to be before and after biofouling? And so, yes, absolutely, looking at proxies is a very good approach.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. My
May I,
feeling is
François?
that, yes?
Yes, no, just to complement, I agree with Lauren, and I understand that we need to have a combination of approaches from the global perspective to the local one, perhaps using modeling as a tool, but also from the local level to the global level, upscaling the information we get from the local situations. And in this way, I think citizen science is an important aspect to be fostered, but especially in ways that we can validate the information gathered by people using perhaps images and perhaps using the logic we have from satellites to mobile applications, so that we can have automatic analysis of images, so that we can get the possibility to have information from more areas and for a long time. And this will depend who is doing that. And this is an important aspect that I mentioned related to the institutional arrangement. Who is doing that? Are employees from municipalities? We will rely on NGOs that may have or not the interest, continued interest in this issue. We will rely on the support of Navy, which have several offices along the coast. So this is an important discussion that we need to understand how this could be done in different countries with different institutions in place.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I understood that, I mean, recycling of plastic could be a way to solve the pollution, and so monitoring is one part, but I mean, acting to prevent pollution is another one. And I would like to ask to Denise if she thinks that, I mean, we may reach one day 100% recycling of plastics, and to give value to the plastic that may help to avoid, I mean, them coming to the sea. Denise?
Yeah, excuse me, sorry, I was still on mute. Yeah, this is not exactly my area about knowing all about recycling technologies, but from what I can say is that recycling is really still an end-of-life solution of the plastic. And so really the better way would to be have produce less plastic and use less plastic. So recycling, similar to biodegradable plastic or bio-based plastic, is really just an alternative material and not necessarily reducing the volume and mass of material that we're producing all the time. So I think that more sustainable for the environment is really to fundamentally rethink our relationship with this material. I mean, in my presentation, I do mention that there are really necessary, maybe more environmentally sustainable uses for plastic, but I still think an overall reduction is key, whether that material is better recyclable, bio-based, or biodegradable.
Yes, but if it's recyclable, then that's more value, then it's not the end of life. It's just, I mean, there's new life starting for it, and so maybe it will help, I mean, preventing from pollution, no?
Well,
I mean,
in terms of recycling, preventing pollution, that's the case because at least it's well managed in that case and not entering the environment. But oftentimes, even with recycling, there's a downgrading of material if you recycle multiple times.
Yes,
so
but
you don't necessarily get 100% back.
Yes, but what about new materials? There was some paper published in Nature recently about different way to, I mean, linkers such as PDCA for classical polymers like polyethylene and so on, and enabling them to be recycled thousands of times, and the use of enzymatic degradation. I mean, new technology may support that. I mean, real recycling, not just only,
So different types of biotechnologies and valorizations of plastics would be a really good aspect, of course, but I think that, you know, we still might be a long way from actually cost effectively reaching those goals. Even if there was a new paper in Nature, it might take a little while from nature to industry.
Okay, I understand that very well. Thank you very much, then, Denise. Maybe back to Alex about the role of education to address the marine challenge. Do you have an idea of, I mean, the role of education and its impact on governance and so on? Or?
Yes. In fact, we are developing some initiatives here in Brazil to support teachers, basic school teachers, to think about how to use marine litter as a strategy to mobilize students for a transformation. the transformation of the society. And the logic of this discussion is that the sea is sick because the society is sick, and it's not fair, perhaps it's not ethic to think about marine litter without to consider the roots. And in Brazil, it's completely associated to poverty, the roots of the sources of the litter. So we are trying to think this issue holistically so that we can, including use inland municipalities who are considered inland municipalities to engage the issue of marine litter, because it's so distant, but it's so close too, because the sea starts in the streets of the cities, the water that's there that moves to the ocean later. So education is very important, but we need to understand which kind of education. And we are supporting what we call critical education, environmental education that makes students to criticize and understand
citizen science maybe more than just educate informed. Huh?
Yeah, there are several types. We have formal and not formal education. Informal education is also important, but we have 38 million students here in Brazil. So formal education is a way to upscale the issue in a proper way.
Okay, so I have also some question to the representative from the Regional Sea Convention. I'm sure that they will.
If you allow me to,
yes, for sure.
Thank you. If you allow me just to add a word from the this education aspect, I would say that the behavior change we hope will certainly come from communication and dissemination of research results. And we in the Abidjan Convention, we think that youth and women are essential to this process. And for example, in pilot phases, we plan to support schools so that education in environmental conservation can take place from an early age. This is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, I will stay with Regional Sea Convention. I have some questions to the representative. So to you, Dr. Abdoulaye Diagana, and also Marieke Effeling, she's a colleague, and Christopher Corbin. How important is marine litter monitoring in your regional action plan, and how we can harmonize at the level of the Atlantic Ocean altogether, or Regional Sea Convention from the Atlantic together?
Thank you. First of all, I don't know if you everybody is familiar with the Abidjan Convention. Just one word, I will present it. The Abidjan Convention covers, can say, the entire Atlantic coast of the African continent. It includes 22 countries spread over 40,000 kilometers of coastline from South Africa to Mauritania. The Abidjan Convention provides a platform for regional cooperation for its member states. And to answer the question directly, I would say that the importance of monitoring the health of our ocean is reflected in the cooperation tools that we developed, namely the basic text of the Abidjan Convention, the action plan for the implementation of the convention itself, the sub-regional contingency plan for combating pollution from accidental oil spills, the protocol against pollution from land-based sources and activities, and the regional coordination center for marine pollution emergency. We have a lot of other tools. I don't know if you, yeah.
But I mean, you think we may harmonize with other regional sea conventions when you consider monitoring of marine litter, or it's complicated to do?
It's complicated, but we know that it's something we need to do because we are all here. We are aware that the environmental issues don't know borders, and to be sure that we are covering the whole Atlantic region, we need to make this collaboration with the other region, and we are already doing it in the framework of the ACP MEA's 3 program we are developing and financed by UNEP.
But maybe some technical solutions, such as the one from the use of satellites, may cover all regional circumvention areas together in one shot, see? And so maybe that's a technical solution for global monitoring there, no?
It could be a solution, but before we get there, we would need to develop a lot of things. For example, capacity building and developing cooperation between research centers to be sure that we will collect data without having gap in some region. And in fact, now we have gap in some region, and you can easily guess which one.
Okay. May I have the view from Christopher Corbin, Cartagena Convention, please?
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, yes.
Like the Abidjan Convention, we're also a Regional Seas Convention, but covering the Caribbean side. So we cover 28 countries bordering the Caribbean Sea. And just to highlight that, yes, monitoring and assessment was identified as one of the key pillars for our regional marine litter action plan. And it identified that there was need to strengthen monitoring efforts in the region. But that was developed since 2014, and there's been so much happening on monitoring that as part of our new regional marine litter strategy that was developed to support the work on marine litter, we actually identified some key goals for monitoring and assessment moving forward. And given the discussions, I thought it would be useful just to quickly highlight how we are approaching it in the region. So one of the goals being to reduce the risk to human health and the environment. A second one, generally to improve national monitoring and assessments for marine litter. A third one being to somehow bridge that gap between the scientific research and the policy making. There's so much good science going on, but we recognize that it's not really being used to inform policy. A lot of the monitoring that we had started was actually more towards advocacy, all of the cleanups, and we want to see now how we can actually improve that as a way moving forward. Touching on your question on harmonization and collaboration across the regional seas, my colleague already mentioned one project that is very important, but I also wanted to identify our efforts to collaborate with the OSPA Commission in developing a harmonized monitoring manual. So we took what was happening in the Abidjan, and then we tried to adapt it to our region, and now we're looking to test that as a methodology. So we agree, we think there's a lot of opportunity for regional seas collaboration on monitoring.
So it means that there is a way to have something like harmonized at the Atlantic level then later, probably.
Yes. Now, although I'm saying that, what we realized when we looked at the monitoring being done in OSPA, for example, in the Northeast Atlantic, there are certain types of marine litter that are just not as relevant for our region. So there needs to be some adaptation to suit the local circumstance, but at least the principle of the data process, the gathering, the analysis, it would be great if that could be better harmonized.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher. May I have the view from OSPA Convention, please, Mariek?
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot, Francois. At OSPA, we are lucky that we have quite some experts in our expert group on marine litter, and I think we have both working areas on the monitoring, working on several indicators, and we have an action plan really focusing on the prevention side. And it is a challenge to combine both. You see really different kinds of expertise necessary for both, but we try our best and in such a way that our monitoring work is an important basis for what we do in our action plan. I mean, the best information that we have, also on the sources, for instance, of what we should do, which items we can decrease part of marine litter, and in that way, we think, that's really, but it's a challenging work. So we are presently working on our yes.
No, please.
Okay, on our second action plan, and we try to connect it better with the monitoring because it's really important. And
Yes, until now, the point is that regional conventions are building on, I would say, traditional approaches. I mean, not so many are considering new technology, satellites, and so on. And so it could be, there could be, a big change in the future on the way to monitor. I mean, actually, OSPA is not monitoring floating, but maybe it may be possible. It might be possible to do so just with developing technology, isn't it?
Yes, I think they offer great opportunity. We should really, it should be a combination for sure for the next years. Continue what we're doing, trying to develop what we have further, but also look into the new technologies and see what kind of opportunities there are there. And if there are opportunities for even a better collaboration with other regional sea conventions, that would be really valuable. But just as Chris also mentioned on the collaboration that is already there between OSPA and the Cartagena Convention, we should for sure try to share as much as possible what we have, and then also for the future on the new technologies, and try to strengthen our collaboration.
I think there was a meeting yesterday or the day before yesterday to trying to harmonizing the different regional action plans from the different regional convention in Europe. So this is exactly what we need at the Atlantic level, I would say, yeah, probably in the future.
The meeting was actually focused on actions, regional action plans. So perhaps we need another one on monitoring.
Exactly. Okay, good. Then maybe I will participate then with pleasure.
Francois, maybe can I?
Sure.
If I can jump in, from what I heard, I would recommend to strengthen the collaboration between specialists to make funding available for research and to put in place, protocols for data collection and reporting. Yeah. It will also be necessary, I think, to develop cooperation between research centers in the South and the North, as well as the South-South cooperation. This could be done, for example, through visiting experts. I don't know if this had been mentioned before. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that one database may collect from all over the world, and it could be located, I don't know where, but I mean, just one may help to support all kind of monitoring. What I would like to have is the view from European Commission on monitoring, the future of monitoring and the way they may imply citizens, for instance, and how they see, the extension to all countries in the Atlantic, for instance. With the experience that has been gained from the work done in Europe, if they see that it's possible to go for further, implementation at a larger scale.
Good afternoon, everybody, and hello, Francois, and thanks very much for putting the issue of monitoring at the center of the discussion, because it is something that too often is considered as something quite technical, not very, if I may say so, not very sexy, and people like to speak about other things when it comes to marine pollution and not about monitoring. So thanks for that. If I may come to your question, my opinion is that concerning the future of monitoring, we should first make sure that there will be one in terms of having a proper monitoring system at national and regional level to serve our needs. So this would be the first requirement, that is to say, to put the appropriate emphasis and resources on monitoring. This is one thing. The second thing is that you and other speakers highlighted the two main issues. First being harmonization, or let's say compatibility of various monitoring techniques, and second, link with policy. And let me come to this by giving you an example. You said you don't want to highlight too much what the EU is doing. I do want to highlight it, not only because I work in the Commission, but also because I think it is worth highlighting. In terms of monitoring and links with policy, we have a very good example of the Single-Use Plastic Directive interacting with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, because thanks to the monitoring, which, by the way, is legally binding for our member states. So thanks to this monitoring, we could have the data that gave us, that supported the analysis for the Single-Use Plastics Directive. We identified the products that we find on the beaches, and on the basis of this monitoring, we made the Single-Use Plastics Directive. By the way, we also, as you very well know, Francois, we also adapt our monitoring protocol now, because we want to make sure that what we banned or restricted through the Single-Use Plastic Directive will not be found anymore on the beaches. And so we have a constant, how shall I say, interaction between monitoring and policy making in terms of reducing marine litter. Now, future technologies. I have to admit, I don't know much about them, but I was very interested in listening to the presentation about satellite, let's say, monitoring. This is something of great importance for us because we do have such systems for monitoring other types of marine pollution, like oil, for example. We have the European Maritime Safety Agency, which has a whole safe sea net and clean sea net, let's say, system. And we are very much interested in, to the extent possible, expanding this infrastructure to capture also marine litter. But again, of course, future technologies have a place, but as other speakers already highlighted, it will be a part of the whole solution. It will not be the only solution. And in the meantime, we should, as I said, make sure that there is compatibility between the various monitoring systems, that they can speak with each other, and that we also have a close link with policymaking. So the last thing that I would like to address, because you mentioned it, is linked with citizen science. As you rightly said, citizens are very much involved in marine litter, in the fight against marine litter, and this is very helpful and very important in terms of awareness raising and in terms of behavioral change. Not only in terms of how we behave at the beach, but in terms of how we behave with our waste and wastewater. And having said that, we must be careful not to mix awareness raising with official and national monitoring schemes. And sometimes, because as I said, each actor and each stakeholder and each action has its role. We need everybody at all levels, but we also must make sure that everybody is doing their work in the proper frame.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank you very much. I will switch to Heidi. And I mean, I understand that, I mean, actually we are discussing a very, very important thing. It's the global governance of marine litter under UNEA, United Nations Environmental Assembly. And I mean, discussions are ongoing. And what I would like to know from the GPML is there is a will and a view on what will be the global governance on marine litter. How does the scientific knowledge support this change, evolution? And also, if there are some plan for a platform to support both the convention that is under discussion, but also monitoring. If there is a way to technically support also the monitoring. The idea is to have something like the for climate change, the IPBS, EPBS that is supporting, I mean, collecting data, analyzing, and so on. To have the same kind of group to support the global monitoring that could be managed by the platform from UNEA. And the view of Heidi would be very important for that. Heidi, please.
Thank you, Francois. I'll start with just highlighting that we are, of course, moving towards the second part of UNEA 5, which will be held in February. And that's where a lot of the discussions are taking place amongst the countries and stakeholders of what is really needed at the global level and what are the steps to get there. At UNEA 5.2, many countries feel that there should be given a mandate for an international negotiating committee, which would then further refine and decide on or guide UNEA on what are options to consider for a potential framework or instrument. So these are the discussions, and there are some informal initiatives that are ongoing with a ministerial conference convened by the governments of Germany, Ghana, Ecuador, and Vietnam, for example, that are ongoing to kind of really try and get the range of views, because of course not everyone feels the same way. So it's important to take this opportunity to really hear from all voices on what the way forward is, so you can highlight and find commonalities. With regard to if we look at the journey of how did we get here? Well, a long time ago in '95, we already started looking through the Global Program of Action at marine litter as a source category. This continued with work at regional levels in around 2006 and 2007, looking at the assessment of what's the situation of marine litter in various regional seas. And I think that process really helped by looking at the assessment and putting together what scientific information was available at regional level. Like that, I think helped inform and move this process forward, because it's a very participatory process of being part of the development of an action plan. And now there are, of course, 13 of 18 regions that have these plans, with another 3 being drafting in them. When it was picked up by the UN Environment Assembly in 2014, then of course we were also asked as UNEP to put together kind of what is the scientific basis, what's the state of knowledge again in 2014 on the topic. Took it to 2016 and then looked at what our governance situation. Very fragmented governance situation around the world for the topic at various levels. And that's kind of where this has gone. So it's really been driven by the science behind, and there are multiple actors contributing to this, to getting us to where the stage as we are. But I think it's important to highlight this when we're looking at discussing governance, what is it that we are going to govern, or what is it that needs to be governed? Well, there are multiple aspects, both from source to sea, more of a spatial contribution setup, as well as life cycle, across life cycle of plastics, for example. And looking at especially how do you make this relevant? How do you make science speak with policy? Well, usually by bringing in the aspect of risk to whether it's ecosystems, to finances, economies, and so on. That's also a way of guiding where do you focus effort in your governance. And this is where then, for example, UNEP is working with as supporting for the Global Partnership of Marine Litter, bringing together all these different efforts that are really moving the whole discussion forward into a digital platform where we're trying to see how can that facilitate the communication between science and policy, and also maybe visualize a bit.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Heidi. I'm sorry we don't have so much time, if I understand well. What I would like to say is that, I mean, I understood that, I mean, technologies is a way to support science first, but also monitoring and then policies. But it was mentioned, especially by Abdoulaye Diagana, that, I mean, human resources must be considered, and especially some countries. So I think it's quite important to try to merge both together, and then we may reach something like useful in terms of governance, I think.
Thank you. Maybe just one answer to our question with respect to the question about priorities for behavioral change. I would say that the approach will need to be inclusive. I would say that we need to think about a paradigm shift from thinking about cleaning up to thinking about limiting or preventing debris from getting into the marine environment. This implies that we stop thinking of the sea as starting at the edge of the square or the short line and start thinking of it as starting in our kitchen or backyard. I think this could be a first step to understand that we need to limit the catastrophe here.
I do have a question to you. I mean, I will participate in the panel later this afternoon on, I mean, rethinking the way we organize the work on ocean and so on. And may I promote the work and may I promote global monitoring there and say that we do have something in place. We do have some regional sea conventions. We do have some science. We do have some citizens already involved, many initiatives worldwide and so on. Atlantic could be, I mean, some way to test it, but I mean, trying to promote it. You think it may be relevant that would be the place for that? I've been discussing with DG Research and Innovation already, and probably they are aware of, I mean, interested in that, and that could be a way to promote because it's a ministerial meeting and some decision may come from. What is your feeling about that? It's not about, I mean, a meeting that will decide, but I mean, promoting, I mean, states and so on could be something like pushing in that direction. Do you think it's a good idea or?
The discussion that's ongoing, I think it's essential to have a discussion around where different entities and countries stand so that you really move towards a common understanding and agreement, because UNEA is a platform that is operating by consensus. Yes. So you can't be all in agreement and then one or two, or you never know how many are not. So that whole participatory dialogue, yes, where you're hearing and you're taking the difficult discussions sometimes on,
yes,
what
would that be the way, I mean, the panel to push the countries participating to support the process of UNEA, for instance, towards a global monitoring?
Well, it's also knowing about what is the, what are the implications. for countries, because they're very different realities in different regions. So that it's very clear what different countries are committing or agreeing to. So they feel that there is also the support for capacity building, for financing, for technology transfer, to be able to feel confident in agreeing to different things, for example.
And maybe just to build on that and reemphasize how important it is that one size does not fit all. So it's really, first of all, to highlight those common goals at a higher level, but how does that actually get implemented within the different countries, considering capacity constraints? How do we consider small island developing states? How do we consider developed countries? And I think it's really important to have that dialogue so they can be that built-in capacity building and training. I just wanted to quickly add too that as we're talking about, coming together and agreeing on some common goals and targets, we also have to understand, if we're going to try to expand and improve the monitoring, to actually identify why are we monitoring and what are we monitoring, because it's a very intensive process. I think it needs to influence policy, as has been mentioned, but it's still also part of an advocacy awareness raising effort. So I think it's clear to identify your specific goals and then cater the monitoring to be able to respond to that. Thanks.
But maybe supporting the action of the regional sea conventions and GPML is the way.
Definitely. We see ourselves as a platform to support the global work, but adapting it to the unique regional specificity,
No, I understand.
Abidjan and so on.
Yeah, okay.
Can I follow on what Christopher just said, if I may, because I think that's really okay. I am a mere scientist. All I am really have got like a tiny little part in this huge puzzle that everyone has been talking about today. And this is a question genuinely. Because for me, everything that we do on a monitoring scale feels reactive. Obviously, the plastic has entered the system and our goal is to monitor it. It's a reactive response. And for me, my end goal would be to be completely irrelevant. I'm not needed because no more plastic is actually making it into the ocean. And I assume that we're doing all of this to feed back into legislation and policy. But I have to ask, is the elephant in the room here, or maybe a missing person in the room, industry? Okay, so we put the burden all of the time on the consumers. We talk about education and changing of behavior, and I feel like that's super important. But within the context of an industry that has a vested interest in producing de novo plastics on a continual basis and to grow the sector, to grow their profit, how much can a consumer change their behavior when their only option is plastic? When the global plastic trade continues to put plastic waste from recycling plants into Southeast Asian countries and African countries. Like, I feel like we're talking about all of this, but we're fighting this uphill battle. The pressures on the consumer or the post. So it's a question, and I'm very pleased to see Heidi's hand up, and I hope that I can have some light on this issue, because I get frustrated and I feel powerless.
I mean, there is an useful part of plastic anyway. Yeah? It's lowering carbon emission. It's,
exactly.
anything, yes. And so, the problem is not the plastic. The problem is the end of life of plastic. And so when we'll be able to solve that, I think that most of the problem will be solved.
Yeah,
and
we know recycling.
It's like human, this is the end of life that is a problem. Huh?
Yeah, and we know that recycling is not working. It's less than 9% of plastics ever produced since the 1950s.
So it means that it could be the focus then for researchers. Focusing. I will support. European Commission funding €1 billion to. Find recyclable plastics.
Yeah,
that makes sense, because the challenge is so that I was explaining European Commission because I'm working for Europe, but it could be anywhere. Huh? And a good solution for recycling will be really useful, and that's a critical step. Maybe Denise knows better than us about that.
No, I am really not a material scientist, nor involved in industry, nor knowing about recycling. So that's why I tried to evade your previous question, but you caught me again.
Okay, shall we close the discussion, or do you have any issue to raise? Or?
Can I just add quickly that I think it's key when we're talking about risk, is also risk to investors that are investing in plastic production, which is scheduled to increase, because there are opportunities, but considerable risks for them as well.
Yeah.
If we are continuing to treat plastic as something very disposable without too much responsibility at some point in time. Thank you.
And you know, the pressure, I mean, I know some people working in companies, they are crafting plastic and so on. I mean, they feel more and more pressure, I mean, on them just because they are working in the plastic industry. And it's really, I mean, incredible how the things are changing. You know, we gave 6 Nobel Prizes to inventors of different types of plastics, such as nylon and so on. And I suppose that some of the Nobel Prizes to come will come to probably more environmental friendly materials, probably. You know, and we feel the difference, at least in Europe. It's very clear that the way the people are feeling plastic, the use of plastics is really changing. Yeah. Okay, so I thank you very much for your contribution. I think we'll close the meeting now. I hope we will be able to continue somewhere sometimes. Sure, there will be some other discussion, and I'm really supporting of the global monitoring, the idea of global monitoring, and having a platform to organize the things. And I suppose that if a global agreement is, I will say, set, then probably I will push for having something like monitoring done, organized to help, I mean, not only the countries, but governments to reduce plastic pollution. So I thank you very much. I hope if you no other points, then I can close the meeting.
Thank you all for joining, speakers, panelists, and attendees. I think it was a really exciting 2 hours, 2 hours and 10 minutes. Sorry again for the technical glitches. And I think Francois is right by saying that we need to continue this discussion in the future, and hopefully GeoBlue Planet can provide that frame for scientists and stakeholders, and hopefully in some time the industry as well, to talk together, because I think that's where we should be going. And once again, I will thank the speakers and the panelists, because I think it was a really successful event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.